Today I'm going to talk about my research. That was a part of my PhD research. I was looking at employees' DEI experiences in the MNC subsidiaries located in Pakistan. I'm going to talk about today some of the practical takeaways from my research, because I believe that this is very important and very useful for MNC subsidiaries planning to open up local offices in Pakistan. The major finding of my thesis was that the local context itself can sometimes become a tension-filled context for MNC subsidiaries that can lead to dilution of DEI initiatives, leading to employee experiences of skepticism, lack of ownership, and disengagement. So the natural question that comes to our mind after this is that what organizations can then do to make sure that there's no gap between what the organization intends to do and what it actually does, and in terms of employees' experiences. The most important thing that I want to talk about here is the strategic flexibility. Because strategic flexibility, when I was doing my research and I was collecting data and I was analyzing that and I was in my preliminary stages of analysis, I reflected back, I questioned myself that just because there is so much, because I was looking at their global DI agendas, I was looking at their local websites, and then I was looking at the local employees' experiences, and there were differences. The global websites are very different, the local ones are very different, the employee experiences are totally the opposite. So the first question that came to my mind is that what if this is the strategic flexibility, and this is where you see this globally you follow XYZ, locally you have a slightly different agenda, and then employee experiences. So what if this is strategic flexibility? This is something that I questioned myself, that if the data that was coming back was even worth it, because my point is to have strategic flexibility, but then what if this is? But then I started analyzing it. Started analyzing the interview transcript, and then I started correlating it with what the organization claims were on their website. And then I started noticing very huge differences between these two. Because if it was strategic flexibility, then employee experiences should have been wonderful, of course, because then they're happy that you have strategic flexibility, and then the organization itself is adjusting it and redirecting itself as per the local customs and traditions. But let me bring first clarity here that strategic flexibility is not about hiding behind the guise of strategic flexibility. That's not, saying that you're flexible, rolling back your DEI initiatives just because the culture is too tough, too traditional, too conservative. That is not strategic flexibility. That is the guise of strategic flexibility. Avoiding difficult conversations is not strategic flexibility. Basing your DEI agendas at the minimum level is not strategic flexibility. At compliance level, and sometimes in some cases it was not even at compliance level. And then assuming that your employees' expectations and demands do not change, the culture doesn't change, that is again not strategic flexibility. Strategic flexibility is more about responding to local nuances. Now, let me give you an example. Pakistan is high power distance, deference to authority, agreed. Highly collectivist, in-group, out-group, okay. High on uncertainty and avoidance, not very open to change, not very adaptable. So that means that the organizations have to find ways to understand what the culture is and make incremental changes. Now, incremental meaning taking small steps towards understanding the culture and then piloting programs which are acceptable by the local community. So I put forward a few suggestions for that. The first key takeaway from my research was that most of the organizations focus on objective diversity measures like age, gender, ethnicity, nationality that you can readily observe. But in my research, when I was looking at and researching at the individual level, I also figured out that rather invisible diversity measures like personality, mentality, they are also very useful and helpful when it comes to people forming bonds with other people, with colleagues. So while the most of the DEI agendas are focused on objective diversity measures, there could be steps taken to cater for these invisible, rather invisible diversity dimensions such as personality and mentality. Some of the ways can be having project-based tasks, focus on the shared goals, because then the focus is away from individual differences and more on commonalities, which in this case is organizational goals, team goals, or project outcome, and so on. Secondly, going back to the point of strategic flexibility, if they are to be strategically flexible, so I came up with 5 steps for them, which can be very helpful, starting off with a cultural audit to understand the nitty-gritties of the culture itself, because most of the MNCs are coming from an entirely different culture. So it's very important for them to understand what the culture is about. And then looking at and preparing plans that they think would be more suitable. Then starting off with the pilot project, because the country is collectivist, it's high power distance, high uncertainty avoidance, not very open to change. The culture is very traditional, very conservative. So piloting such programs will be useful for the reason that you're going to get some initial insights on how it is being received, what are the tension points, where they need to focus more, so that once they start rolling out their DEI agendas, they know what language is to be used to roll those out, and then having a constant mechanism of feedback and accountability, which was also reported in the data as being missing between the local subsidiary and the parent organization, that there was no accountability, no feedback mechanisms, which was leading to the disconnect between these processes. Then another important insight was that in Pakistan, gender is the most prominent diversity category, but at the same time, there are patriarchal norms, which means that segregate women into different roles. The ones that are found more suitable are of being a wife or a mother or a sister or a daughter. And the culture itself is very traditional and conservative when it comes to having women at workplaces. So there were cases of harassment, there were cases of biasness. So how do we deal with that? So now, considering that all those issues and difficulties that women were facing, perhaps having programs that specifically focus on women could be very useful, which means that having flexible working options, childcare facilities. People in my data also reported about the lack of mentoring, female mentoring opportunities. That could be one thing. And then longer maternity leaves, helping them in their career transition when they become a mother, when they become a parent. So the programs which are specifically aligned with women's needs, and then helping them to create a good balance between the different role expectations that they have in a traditional conservative society such as Pakistan. Another thing could be that in the data there was a clear disconnect between the hierarchical layers. The leadership was saying something else, the managers were saying something else, the employees had different experiences. So why that's happening? So I came up with some solutions for that as well. The leadership to be more vocal about their commitment to DEI, and also some tiny initiatives like coffee with the CEO, town hall meeting with the CEO, or the CEO just walking on the floor and talking to people. These are very important because it gives people a chance to speak to the senior management, helps deal with the high power distance deference to authority element of the culture, and make leaders more vocal and more visible within the organization. When it comes to the middle management layer, so they were confused. So in some cases there was lack of training, in some cases there was lack of awareness. So this can be then built into their KPIs with appropriate accountability and audit mechanisms, so that they are clear that how this is built into their regular KPIs, how DEI is built into their regular KPIs within the organization. For the other employees, it's very important to get the message across, because there were obvious communication gaps, in the language that they would understand. And for that, you can use technology. You can have digital communication boards. You can have work WhatsApp groups. These are very useful because you can share small success stories of people, of their colleagues, of employees, with the larger bit of the organization, so that they are constantly reminded of the organization's commitment to DEI in the local subsidiary. Then another issue was a lot of pushback from the society, because it's highly collectivist. There's a notion of Western organizations coming, doing something locally, so they resist because it's not very open to change, and it's not very easy to adapt, so it resists change. So how can we go around that? So I put forward some suggestions for taking local stakeholders on board. By local stakeholders, that could mean the government officials in the policy making capacity. There could be NGOs helping the marginalized communities to voice their concerns. It could be educational institutes, because the data reflected the gaps in the talent pipeline. So it could be educational institutions. It could be the members of the marginalized communities themselves. It could be the people from religious and social communal groups, because the role of religion is very huge, because Pakistan is an Islamic state. Religion is everything for them. So having them on board would also be very useful. Then having some local union bodies, that can also work. So involvement of all of these stakeholders would not just signify organization's commitment to DEI, but will also signal to the local community that this is not something foreign. I mean, they don't have to close up to preserve their traditional values. This is something that is totally aligned with the values, traditions, and customs of the country. And then I also suggested a reflexive model, which meant that earlier I spoke about strategic flexibility, but I would also like to talk about that where there is strategic flexibility, it is equally important to consider these sites not just as the sites to adapt or to be flexible about, but also how it actively you can take the information and knowledge learned from these sites back to the parent organization. For example, my data reflected issues like LGBTQ issues, and then there was a lot of uproar in the local community. So if this, constant communication was happening, constant flow of information was happening between the parent company and the subsidiary, such kind of misunderstandings could be easily avoided instead of not focusing on the different sensitivities of the local context.